Good evening and welcome to this night's episode of Viking.TV. This is Wanderlust Wednesdays. My name is Joost Ouendag. I'm one of a greater team of people that puts together our itineraries and our shore excursions. And tonight I'm going to be talking to you about our Alaska cruise, Alaska and the Insight Passage. And we will kick this off with a brief video that gives you a broad overview. And after that, I will walk you through the itinerary on a day-by-day basis, and after that, I'll be here to answer any questions you may have.
Few cruise destinations can match the sheer majesty of Alaska. Enjoy an in-depth exploration of gold rush ports and rarely visited gems on an 11-day itinerary with Viking. Your journey begins in fascinating Vancouver, Canada, where you may want to plan a little extra time to take in the best of this intriguing melting pot of cultures. From the moment you set sail, scenic wonders unfold as you glide through the Inside Passage. A series of spectacular islands and sheltered waterways lining the coast of British Columbia and southeast Alaska. Throughout your voyage, you'll want to spend as much time out on deck as possible, taking in views of the snow-capped mountains, forested islands, and abundant wildlife, ranging from bald eagles circling in the sky to humpback whales surfacing on the glassy waters. Your first Alaskan stop is Ketchikan, the quaint, self-described salmon fishing capital of the world. Explore historic Creek Street, its boardwalk winding through a beautiful collection of frontier buildings, reminiscent of a bygone era. From there, you'll head for Sitka, once the capital of Russian Alaska. That country's influence remains clearly evident in sites like the onion-domed Russian Orthodox Cathedral and Russian Bishop's House. Juneau, located up the scenic Gastineau Channel, is Alaska's state capital, a small city with a big personality. A city that also has its own glacier, the epic Mendenhall. In colourful Skagway, soak in its frontier charm as you explore the Gold Rush era wooden sidewalks and Klondike goldfields aboard the White Pass and Yukon Route Railroad. Learn about Tlingit culture at Icy Strait Point with a traditional presentation and fishing culture at the former fish canning station. A day of scenic sailing in the awe-inspiring Yakutat Bay brings you face-to-face with the towering icy face of Hubbard Glacier, one of Alaska's largest tidewater glaciers. Gold prospectors once flocked to Valdez, Alaska's northernmost ice-free port. Today you can delve into the town's history on a walking tour, or perhaps try your hand at salmon fishing. Your voyage concludes with an overnight stay in Seward. Wildlife enthusiasts will enjoy a visit to the Alaska Sea Life Center, while those looking for more adventure may want to set out for the wilderness of Katmai National Park.
After this brief overview, I will provide you with a quick recap, and then we will get into the details of the itinerary a little bit more. Alaska and the Insight Passage is a cruise that you can book in two directions, and today we will focus on the Vancouver to Seward direction. Throughout the journey, the ship stays close to the spectacular coastline of the Pacific Northwest, and that means in the southern portion you will see the temperate rainforest, and then as you get further north, eventually you will get into a landscape with very tall mountains and glaciers that reach all the way to the water's edge. And on your journey there, you will be able to observe pods of orcas, an occasional humpback whale, whatever wildlife there is on the shores, because for much of the journey, you will really be able to observe what goes on land. That's how close the ship usually stays to the shore. After embarking in Vancouver, the next day is spent sailing through the Insight Passage. That's a series of narrow waterways between Vancouver Island and the mainland, and on day 3 you arrive in Ketchikan. Days 4 through 6 you visit Sitka, Juneau, and Skagway, and on day 7 you visit the native settlement of Icy Strait Point. On day 8, again there's a full day of scenic sailing, before on day 9 you get to Valdez, and at the end of the cruise you spend time in Seward, Alaska, the original historical starting point of the Iditarod dog sled race, but we will get to the Iditarod in due time. If you have a little bit more time before cruising with us, you have two options for a pre-extension package. The first one is a straightforward 2 nights in Vancouver, and that will just allow you to catch your breath a little bit after a long flight, to settle in, to make your way to the ship on the day of embarkation, nice and slow, and it will allow you some time to explore the city itself. And Vancouver is really the cultural capital of Western Canada. It has a lot of influences from all over the world. So it's a city that has spectacular restaurants that offer cuisine from Asia, from North America. It even has a little bit of indigenous flavor here and there. It has some great museums. It has beautiful views. It has great walks. There's a lot to do in Vancouver. The second option is a pre-package that is wrapped around one of the most spectacular railway journeys in the world. The Rocky Mountaineer is a train that starts in Banff or in Jasper and brings you to Vancouver. And on its way, it goes through the Canadian Rockies, through the coastal mountains in the British Columbia interior. And it is truly one of the most spectacular railway journeys in the world. This slide shows you a map of the itinerary. And this is a good opportunity to talk a little bit about the weather. Now, we travel to Alaska in the spring and in the summer months, late spring and then through the summer, typically from May to August and sometimes into early September. That allows us to take advantage of warmer temperatures, but also of more sunshine. But even with the slightly warmer weather during the time of year, you will still need a warm jacket or a coat for the evening. You bring layers so that you can adjust to the changes in temperature, which in Alaska can be fairly rapid. If you're interested in wildlife photography, the best time to travel is probably in late May and early June, because that's when the animals and their young tend to be the most active. As it gets hotter, the animals tend to retreat and come out more at night. And then the final thing that is kind of special about this itinerary that you can keep in the back of your head is that you will have an awful lot of daylight. In many ports, it's not unusual to have 17 to 19 hours of sunlight. And the longest day of the year, of course, June 21st, marks the summer solstice. And then Alaska gets 22 hours of sunlight. And that basically means that it never really gets entirely dark. And that makes for spectacular evenings, spectacular sunrises, and it makes for great photography. Let me talk a little bit about the way that Viking does its shore excursions. Whenever we visit a port, we try to give you as comprehensive an overview and as comprehensive a choice as we can. And with that choice, it's always very important to us that we go beyond the iconic and the expected, and we try to surprise you in a few ways. And what we have found is that our audience really wants to have an understanding of the destination through the people that live there. And that has led us to create a series of excursions that we refer to as the Viking Way. There are local life experiences where you get an insight into the rhythms of daily life for people. In Alaska, you can learn about the rich culture and heritage of the Chilkat community of the Tlingit people, or you can learn how to fillet and smoke and kipper salmon, or discover methods of harvesting and preparing medicinal tea. The working world are excursions that focus on how people make a living. You get a sense of what people do when they leave the house in the morning, what kind of local arts and crafts are produced, and it gives you a different perspective yet again on the people that live in the destination. In Alaska, for instance, you get a chance to peek into the life of the Alaska fishermen as you sail on board a genuine crab fishing vessel. Or you catch an elaborate glass blowing demonstration at the Jewel Gardens glass studio. And there are other options as well. Then finally, in some places where we have established relationship over the years, we are able to offer you something that you would not be able to get on your own or with any of the other options that you would have to travel to a destination. In Alaska, for instance, we offer you an opportunity to visit Saxman, which is a small native village a little bit away from Ketchikan. And you also have an opportunity in Valdez to go with one of the local residents into a building that houses a model of the city that normally stays closed, but that's a perfect opportunity and a really interesting and poignant reminder of all the adversity that the city of Valdez went through in its history. It's quite something. Another way in which the Alaska itinerary is somewhat unique in our offering is that there are so many outdoor things to do, and these generally happen with small groups, that you will find that we have quite a few more shore excursions on offer than we normally do. And like I said, quite often these are, if you will, small batch activities. There is something for everyone, and it is important, because they're outdoor activities, quite often, to understand your pacing. I would advise you to really look at the little icons that we put next to the shore excursion descriptions. And perhaps if you're uncertain about something, you can make a call into the call center or with your travel agent, because it's important that you get what is right for you. We have everything from sightseeing on a coach to walking tours to things that are a little bit more strenuous. Zip lining, you will be surprised to find out, is actually something that a lot of our guests enjoy. Okay, and after these opening remarks, I hope you're ready to explore Alaska and the Insight Passage with me, port by port. So on day one, you embark your ship in Vancouver. Some of you will join us after a stay in that city for a few days. Others will come from the Canadian Rockies, and yet others will fly into Canada today. We'll pick you up at the airport if you made your travel arrangement through us. And after boarding your ship, you have some time to relax. And if you have a little bit of extra time, Vancouver is really worth maybe a few hours of exploring before the ship sets sail. Vancouver is blessed with a beautiful natural setting, and that means even if you're in the downtown area, the water is never far away. You can always look up at some spectacular mountains that provide a backdrop to the north. And again, the city itself is very cosmopolitan, has influences from many corners of the world. But again, it allows for nice walks along the shoreline. There are even little beaches. You can take a gondola up to the top of the mountain. If you have a little bit of time, I would recommend that you explore. You wake up in the morning and you're traveling through the Insight Passage between Vancouver Island and the Canadian mainland, through the Strait of Georgia, the Seymour Narrows, and the Grenville Channel. And much of this route is lined with temperate rainforest. That means really tall spruce, fir, and cedar trees. And those, of course, provide a perfect perch for big raptors that are looking for fish in the water below, such as this bald eagle. You can also be on the lookout for pods of orcas, sometimes still called killer whales, an occasional humpback whale, and you keep your eyes peeled for whatever happens on the shore. You may spot an occasional black bear, for instance. Aside from your stateroom veranda, the ship has a lot of other places that are just perfect for watching the scenery go by. This is a picture of the library in the Explorer's Lounge, which is one of my favorite places. It's towards the top of the ship. It looks out and forward. You can be inside or outside depending on the time of year and the weather of that particular day. And it just provides perfect views. Our libraries, by the way, are not random collections of books. They're carefully hand-selected by our friends at Haywood Hill, a bookstore in London that takes great care to make sure that we have a selection of books that really fits the Viking guest and that fits exploring the world.
The ships of Viking sail with the most sophisticated, thought-provoking libraries on the water. They're curated by Haywood Hill, a tiny shop in London that just happens to take care of the Queen's book needs too. And for the rest of us, Haywood Hill also offers a yearly subscription plan that delivers a good read chosen just for you every month.
The essence of this business is good writing and our shared love of good writing. And there are 16 of us here and we all have the passion for good books. The heart of what we do here is recommending books individually. And we thought, well, why not open that service to people who can't come into the shop? And so we set up a very bespoke subscription service where one of our expert booksellers, has a conversation, hopefully in person, but perhaps over the telephone or even online, to find out what your taste in reading really is and where you are in your reading. And that begins a fabulous relationship with our shop. I'm pleased to say that that service has really taken off and is happening all over the world. Our subscriptions team read at least 500 titles a year between them. It's an extraordinary thing. My team spends all day thinking about individual customers and what they should read next, what they might like to read the following month.
Haywood Hill is a very special place, filled with intriguing books and inspiring people. I hope you'll do as I did and check out their subscription service for yourself. Or perhaps give it as a gift to someone special.
We now touch land in Ketchikan on day 3. Ketchikan is sometimes called Alaska's first city, and it's home to a lot of native Tlingit people, and that is what you will discover here. The included tour focuses on totem poles and gives you also an overview of the city. There is a privileged access tour of the Saxman Native Village, where you will experience Native American culture through song, dance, stories. And finally, nature lovers here have an opportunity to discover a lot of the local wildlife. One of my personal favorites is Bear Country and Wildlife Expedition, where you will journey to Herring Cover to the Alaska Rainforest Sanctuary, and you can view Alaska bears, eagles, and seals in their natural habitat. If you decide to stay in town, you will find that Ketchikan has a lot of little art galleries, cafes, shops, little neighborhoods, wooden houses in pastel colors. It's really quite charming. Aside from the excursion I just mentioned, there are other opportunities to encounter local wildlife. You always keep your distance, of course, but bears like these are quite plentiful in the region surrounding Ketchikan. On day 4, you arrive in Sitka, and while you're still in Tlingit territory, and you will still see a lot of totem poles in Sitka, you will also notice a Russian flair. There is a large Russian Orthodox church with an onion-shaped dome, and that has to do with the fact that Alexander Baranov arrived here in 1800 to set up a trading post with the Tlingit to bring pelts from otters, and that's the critter that you see in this image, to Russia, where they were turned into hats and coats. One of the things you can do in Sitka to discover more of that heritage is attend a cultural show that focuses on folkloric performances that have a very decided Russian theme. Another is to hop on a boat and fish in the waters off the shore, as you can see in this image. That large mountain in the background is Mount Edgecombe, a volcano that has lain dormant for millennia. On day 5, we welcome you to Juneau, Alaska's capital on the Gastineau Channel, and home to the Tongass National Forest. Juneau is the only U.S. capital inaccessible by road, and that means all goods and travelers must arrive either by sea or by air. As the state capital, Juneau has a lot to offer. There is the Glacier Gardens Rainforest, which is in essence a botanical garden that shows you all the different things that grow in the temperate rainforest that stretches along the Alaska coast. There's the Alaska State Museum, and what you see here is the gondola that takes you up to Mount Roberts. And many people that visit Juneau just want to enjoy the view. It's a very steep mountain that rises right behind the city, and the views from over there are absolutely spectacular, as you can imagine. Throughout this trip, you may spot whales, but Juneau tends to be a really good spot for whale watching. We have several tours that offer it, and on these you keep watch for other wildlife as well, porpoises, seals, birds, whatever is on the water, in the water, or above the water. Juneau is also a city that has its own glacier, if you will, the Mendenhall Glacier, which has a visitor center that is really instructive in explaining exactly what you need to know about a glacier, how it moves, how it evolves, how it grows, how it diminishes. It's very, very interesting. The halfway point of your cruise is Skagway, and Skagway is known for two things: history and the spectacular natural setting. This is an image of Summit Lake, which sits high above in the mountains behind the city, but there's a lot more that you can explore when you get to this port. We also have land-based wildlife viewing tours, such as this one up the Spassky River Valley, in search of local wildlife, including the coastal brown bear, black-tailed deer, and bald eagles. In 1896, gold was found on a tributary of the Yukon River in Canada's vast northern interior, and Skagway became a jump-off point for prospectors on their way to the gold fields. They had to carry on their backs or with dog sleds or with horses a year's worth of provisions over the passes that led into the interior, and Skagway was the place where they got their outfits together. Today you can hop on a train, which makes it a lot easier, the spectacular White Pass Railway that brings you all the way to the pass. We also have an included tour that takes you up to the pass by coach, both of which are highly recommended because the views from atop are just absolutely spectacular. The story of the Klondike Gold Rush and Skagway's part in it is such an epic tale that I would recommend you read not just one but two books about that period of time. The first one would be The Call of the Wild by Jack London, which tells the tale from the perspective of a sled dog. The second is simply called Klondike, and it was written by Pierre Berton, or Pierre Burton, depending on what part of Canada you're from. He grew up in Dawson City, which was in the heart of gold country. As always in Alaska, when you prefer the great outdoors over nature, there are plenty of opportunities. There's also the opportunity to visit a little Chilkat settlement called Klukwon, which is not far from Skagway. The next day brings you to Icy Strait Point, and in the background here, behind the kayakers, you can see a very large canning plant where fish used to be preserved and put in cans to be exported all over the world. It was one of the great benefits of having these rich fishing grounds nearby. Today, the canning station has become a cultural center for the indigenous people that offer a very wide variety of things to do, among them a cultural presentation that is really quite unique. While the choice of shore excursions varies a little bit depending on the time of year and perhaps weather, there is an awful lot to do in Icy Strait Point. We have some 15 shore excursions. You can take an ATV out onto a neighboring island. We also have several ways of getting out onto the water to spot wildlife, perhaps go fishing. And this is a spectacular image to introduce a very spectacular day. This is where you will be cruising through Yakutat Bay and be observing the Hubbard Glacier from up close. This imposing ice wall is at Disenchantment Bay, the very narrow tip of Yakutat Bay. It was named Disenchantment Bay because the Spanish discoverer was really looking for the Northwest Passage. He wasn't interested in natural scenery. He wanted to find a passage for trade. And he did not succeed here. And there's quite a few of these names all along the Northwest coast, where discoverers were disappointed to find what we now travel for to see. Of course, a day like this is also a perfect opportunity to take advantage of the many treatments that we offer in our spa on board. The onboard shops will be open all day, and you can find a special keepsake there, or you can delve into history of the Pacific Northwest during an iconic lecture from your ship's Viking resident historian. On the shores of a deep fjord in Prince William Sound lies the town of Valdez, a fishing port, also known as a transition point for the Alaska Oil Pipeline. On our included tour, you can learn more about Valdez and how it thrives on fishing and on the oil industry. There's lots of colorful little boats in the harbor, fishing boats, and they are docked right alongside the Trans-Alaska Pipeline Terminal. Valdez is a small town, and all around it is grand, majestic nature, which you can explore by helicopter, by kayak, or by fixed-wing plane. There are many ways to discover what's beyond the city limits. Our privileged access tour takes you to the Old Town model, and there you can learn about the devastating Good Friday earthquake that happened in 1964. The town was so extensively damaged that it was moved 4 miles to its current location. Today you get to discover Seward, a seaport named after Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State, a man who in 1867 orchestrated the Alaska Purchase. At that point, Alaska was still part of the Russian Empire, and Seward forged ahead with a plan that many of his contemporaries called Seward's Folly. No one really believed that there was any merit in trying to get this part of the world from the Russians into the American fold. In Seward, you will have another opportunity to meet a dog musher and his dogs and try some dog sledding. Seward calls itself the official start of the Iditarod race. And that Iditarod race is a dog sledding race that takes place between Anchorage and Nome in Alaska. It's almost 1,000 miles long, and it goes back to 1973. That's when they started, but the historical event that inspired the Iditarods took place in 1925. At that time, there was an outbreak of diphtheria in the faraway port of Nome. And in order to inoculate people against the disease, a container with a serum started in Seward and was brought up first by train and then by dog sleds all the way to Nome, more than 1,000 miles away from Seward. The lead dog that arrived in Nome with the serum, his name was Balto, and he became so famous for the event that there's a statue of him, a sculpture, if you will, in New York Central Park. But the great hero of the Iditarod that time in 1925 was a gentleman by the name of Leonard Seppala, a Norwegian who had introduced dog sledding in Alaska. He took the longest stretch of the Iditarod at that time. Remember, it was a relay race, so there were more dog mushers and dog teams involved. And his lead dog was also a hero, a somewhat more unsung hero than Balto. But Togo was a very strong lead dog in his own right. You also have an opportunity to take a privileged access tour of the Alaska Sea Life Center. You can meet aquatic scientists and learn about their research while getting a very up-close look at the animals to observe their behaviors. The next morning in Seward, that is where your journey concludes. After breakfast on board, you will disembark, get to the airport, or perhaps you will stay for a few more days with one of our extension packages. On the northern end of this cruise, there is another fantastic rail journey that we can offer. It takes you into the heart of Denali National Park at the foot of Alaska's and North America's tallest mountain. You go on a wildlife trip where you may see grizzly bear, moose, elk, all kinds of other animals. You will visit on one of the longer journeys. We offer 2 versions. You will visit Fairbanks, major historical city in the center of Alaska, or you can spend 2 nights in Anchorage. Anchorage is the largest city in Alaska, has quite a bit to offer, both in the city itself, a fantastic museum, but also in the surrounding areas. There's an awful lot to do to just stay in Alaska a little longer. And this is it. We reached the end of the presentation. Thank you for staying with me so far. And I'm now looking forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Joost. Our first question tonight comes from Sean in Houston. He says, can you tell us a bit more about the summers in Alaska?
Summers in Alaska are surprisingly warm. It cools down at night, but it's not a place where you need to worry about blizzards in July. It really stays quite nice. You will always need good clothing because you never quite know. But certainly during the day, it's quite often quite nice, especially in the interior. If you were to travel on to Denali Park and to Fairbanks, the weather's quite lovely. On the coast, of course, you do get quite a bit of rain and fog. And that just is part of the natural world that you have on the Pacific Northwest. You are on a temperate rainforest. Well, that's the landscape. It's a temperate rainforest. So layering a little bit of fog, a little bit of rain, but especially when you travel a little further inland already, if you go, for instance, from Skagway up to the White Pass, the weather can change quite dramatically. Even if the day starts off a little dreary, it can be glorious once you're up on the pass.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Mary in Cuca Park. She says, what are the opportunities for watching birds?
Well, in the Pacific Northwest, you're dealing largely with really large birds, bald eagles, ospreys, ravens, and they're everywhere, especially along the water side. These are generally birds of prey that prey on fish, and they're quite plentiful. It would be a strange Alaska cruise if you would not get some really good open views of bald eagles, for instance, and ospreys and other birds.
Fantastic, thank you. Our next question comes from Charles and Anne in Austin. They say, are the Viking ships able to enter the Glacier National Park?
Glacier Bay National Park has a system of permits, and they hand out these permits to cruise ships literally kind of one at a time, and we stand in line like every other cruise company does and try to get our permits. So what you would need to do is call when you make a booking to find out which cruises go into Glacier Bay, because some do and some don't. I can guarantee you that even if you don't go into Glacier Bay, you'll still have a grand time, but you would need to make that call and find out once you've picked a departure, whether the ship is allowed to go into Glacier Bay or not. And it's something that we have very little control over. It's regulated by the government, and there's always only so many ships that are allowed.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Grayson in Chicago. He says, I'm interested in the Rocky Mountaineer extension. Can you tell us a little bit more about this and what the Viking package includes?
Yes. So the Rocky Mountaineer, the train runs from the Canadian Rockies, and that's either Banff or Jasper, down to Vancouver, or vice versa. You can book it as a pre-extension or a post-extension, depending on where you travel, in which direction you travel. And the essence of the train ride is really that 2-day stretch where you go from the Canadian Rockies, through the British Columbia interior. You overnight in Kamloops or in Whistler, depending on the particular date. And then you travel through the coastal mountains to Vancouver. And that train ride is splendid. That's really the heart of the extension. And in order for us to fit the train ride schedule in with the cruise, we have built a few nights before the cruise, or a few nights before the train ride, and then a few nights after the train ride. And it really depends on which date your cruise is, what exactly those two bookends, if you will, entail. Sometimes you can have 3 nights in the Canadian Rockies and 2 nights in Vancouver and Victoria, or the other way around. So make a call, but the heart piece of that is really that train ride. And the Rocky Mountaineer has the train travel down to a T. It's really a very, very bespoke experience.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Helen in Eau Claire. She says, I'd love to see the whales in Alaska. Can you tell us more about which species we would be most likely to spot and how regularly whales and other marine wildlife is spotted from the ship?
Orcas is sometimes called killer whales, but I don't think that's a name that we use that much anymore, are quite frequent in the Inside Passage, also further up north. And humpbacks. Those are the 2 main species. You may see blue whales when you travel, in the Gulf of Alaska. But that's, those 3. Orcas, humpbacks, blue whales.
Thank you. Kay in Atkinson in the United States says, can you get an extension to Fairbanks and also to the Yukon?
Yes, on Fairbanks, no to the Yukon. We have an extension that takes you to Denali Park, and you spend a day there doing the wildlife tour and getting kind of to the foothills of Mount Denali. And there is a variant that goes only as far as Denali and then comes back to Anchorage, and there's one that goes all the way out to Fairbanks. and the Yukon is just a little too far, we feel, for right now. We constantly look into, extending our extensions, if you will. But to do a decent and a proper Yukon program, you need about a week to 8 days post cruise, and we're not quite there yet.
Thank you. Our next question is from Bill in Windsor in Canada. He says, are the fjords very different in Alaska and the Inside Passage from those in Norway?
The Alaska coast is different than the coast in Norway. The Alaska coast is much more mountainous. Much of Norway, you have these enormous plateaus. So you look at these vertical cliffs. I've been to both. I would say, having seen Norway is absolutely not a good reason to not go to Alaska, or vice versa. I would say if you've enjoyed Norway, you will enjoy Alaska just as much. And if you've seen Alaska, you will really like Norway. They're different. There are certainly similarities, but there's enough difference to say, okay, if you like grand natural landscapes, you have to do both. You really do.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Marge in Hilton Head Island in the United States. She says, is there a lot of walking, I guess, on the Alaskan excursions?
Hilton Head is a lovely island, that to begin with. There is quite a bit of walking depending on what shore excursions you pick. So it's a cruise that works well for people that are relatively fit. Having said that, and I think that's also in when I walk through the day by day, it is a cruise where you have 2 full days where all that you do is just relax. You sit on the sun deck, you watch the scenery go by on your stateroom. So just for sheer majestic scenery, it's a perfect cruise for people that are not willing or able to do a lot of walking.
Thank you. Our next question comes from May in the United States, and she says, can you tell us a bit more about the bears that you might see?
Okay, so there are black bears and there are grizzly bears, and brown bears are essentially grizzly bears, and so on and so forth. And the largest bears are the Kodiak bears, but those only you can encounter when you do that one cruise that we have from Alaska, or from Vancouver all the way over to Tokyo. So we'll leave those out for now. Brown bears can climb trees. So if you see a brown bear, don't climb in a tree. If it's a grizzly bear, you can climb in a tree, because grizzly bears tend to not climb trees. That's just for safety. And now, on a more serious note, if you travel to the interior of Alaska, your chances of seeing grizzly bears are quite high, because you do a wildlife tour in Denali Park, and that's, I mean, I wouldn't say it's a certainty, but there's a very good chance that you'll see grizzly bears. There are sporadic grizzly bears that you will see in other places, but primarily what you will find along the coast is black bears. And both species, I mean, you have a reasonably good chance of at least seeing black bear, but also grizzlies.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Jean in Lake St. Louis. She says, I've read Michener's Alaska novel. Is there any other good books to read about Alaska ahead of this cruise?
Yes, anything by Barry Lopez that deals with Alaska. He's written very extensively on the Arctic, and that includes northern Alaska. My favorite on Alaska is Klondike Fever by Pierre Berton, as mentioned. His mother wrote a book, Laura Berton, and that book is called I Married the Klondike. And her husband went to the gold fields of the Yukon. And she just kind of had to go along, and she writes about her experiences. So those two, they're kind of, written by a mother and a son. Michener has written more than just Alaska about that state. There's this other book, and I can't think of the title right now, but there's another James Michener book that I think you should read. But absolutely, the Klondike books, they're just, the Pierre Berton book is just great fun. It's one of my all-time favorite books.
Fantastic. Thank you, Joost. Next question comes from Leah in Sylvania in the United States. She says, how big are your ships that go to Alaska and how many people are on board?
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
She says, how big are your ships that go to Alaska and how many people are on board?
Our ships carry 930 guests. And you know, they have it's our standard ocean cruise ship.
Thank you. Next question is from Mark in Minnetonka in the United States, and he says, on this type of trip, can you go fishing for salmon and halibut?
Yes, you can go fishing, and there's two caveats to this. There's something that's a little strange, but in order to fish in Alaska, you need an Alaska fishing permit, and you need to pay that on the spot. So you pay for the shore excursion, and then when you get to the boat, you need to buy your little fishing permit. This is just one of the oddities of Alaska state law as to how that is supposed to go. And it's important to understand that it's a great adventure to go fishing in Alaska. There's no guarantee that you will catch anything. So that's important to kind of keep in the back of your head. But I would recommend it because it's just great fun. With Viking, we offer fishing in as many ports as we can. You will find on our website quite a few videos that show Torstein Hagen fishing. He really likes it. His daughter really likes it. So it's something that we as a company really get into. But you know, it's keep in mind there's no guarantee, and you can't be mad if you don't catch that great salmon. By the way, Call of the Wild, Jack London. There was a question about the books a few questions ago. Call of the Wild by Jack London, of course, is something that you need to read when you go to Alaska. It's a classic.
That's great. Thanks, Joost. Next question is from Leroy in Detroit, and he says, when staying in Vancouver for the pre-cruise extension, is the hotel within walking distance of Stanley Park?
The hotel is in the west end of Vancouver, and that is not a very large area. And yes, you can walk to Stanley Park. You can also just take a city bus. Walking is probably about 15 to 20 minutes.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Carol in the United States, and she says, where is the best place to watch the grizzly bears?
Best place to watch the grizzly bears is really if you were to book an extension into the Alaska interior, it's Denali Park.
Thank you. Next question is from Rodney in West Lafayette in the United States, and he says, can you see the northern lights on the summer tours?
That's highly unlikely because you have so much sunlight. You need winter light to see the northern lights. You know, and we go to Alaska only in summer. So this is why I had to pause for a second, because yes, in Alaska you have northern lights, but that's not the season that we travel to Alaska, at least not yet. Our Northern Lights cruises, though, they're great fun in Norway, and they're a big success. So at some stage we may look into doing Northern Lights cruises in Alaska as well. We've had great success just figuring out what to do with our guests in northern Norway, and obviously the climate is not all that different up north in Norway from what it is like in Alaska. So who knows? In a few years we'll have winter programs in Alaska.
Thank you, Joost. Next question is from Michelle in Richmond in the United States, and she says, how far into Denali does the post-trip go? Is it far enough to have great views, and is there time for hiking on your own?
Would be from the hotel, and that can still be, there are plenty of hiking trails in the area, so you could certainly do that. On the wildlife tour itself, you stop at a few intervals, and the tour always goes to about the same place. And the answer, as far as the views are concerned, is yes, the views are spectacular and majestic, and the weather does play a role in it. But I've had both. I've had splendid weather, and I've not had not so great weather. That tour is still magnificent. it's one of the, as far as wildlife is concerned, it's not just grizzly bears. It's also it's caribou, moose. It's an occasional smaller critter like a fox. So there's an awful lot to see.
Wonderful, thank you. Next question is from Carol in Potomac in the United States, and she says, what's the best way to see Mount McKinley up close?
The Denali Wildlife Tour.
Great, okay. Another question about the Denali tour is from Miki in Montclair. She says, on the Denali 5-Night Explorer, do you get there by coach or by rail?
By rail.
Thank you. Next question from Rhonda in New York, and she asks, what hotel do you stay in during the Vancouver extension?
Off the top of my head, you would have to look up on the website, because it depends a little bit on the particular date that you're in Vancouver. We use more than one hotel. We try to use the hotel that is in the Pan Pacific Center, which is where the ship docks. So you can basically sleep overnight in a hotel for 2 nights, and then you walk downstairs, and kind of right around the corner is where the ship docks.
Great, thank you. And a question from Sabrina in the United Kingdom. She says, in your personal opinion, what would be your preferred direction of sailing and why?
Preferred direction of sailing. In my personal opinion, it's north, but that's just because I like, the idea of traveling north. It has something to do with, how far can you get away from civilization. But the nice thing about this cruise is that, and again, I've said this before, if you end up booking an extension, you end up on a very high note if you go into the Canadian Rockies, and you end up on a very high note if you go north and you book a trip to Denali National Park. So, but I probably, if I had a choice, I would go north, I think.
Thank you. Another question from Miki in Montclair. She says, in Yakutat Bay, does the ship rotate to get a good view of Hubbard Glacier and also watch the carving of the glaciers?
The carving of the glaciers, to start with that, we need to keep a reasonable distance, but yes, you can watch that. And the ship does cruise in. I mean, there's quite a bit of space to be covered. So the ship does cruise through Yakutat Bay and has to turn around, yes.
Thank you. Tony in Springfield in the United States says, years ago, I recall on a trip to Alaska, panhandling for gold. Is that still possible on an excursion?
Yes, panning for gold is still an option. It's done more towards the interior, so probably the closest in Fairbanks, they still do it a little bit. And it's great fun. But it's really hard to get any kind of gold out of a river anymore.
Thank you, Joost. I think this is our last question for tonight. It comes from Kathy in Markham in Canada. She says, I was in Alaska 30 years ago. One of my highlights was a seaplane over the Mendenhall Glacier from Juneau. Is that an optional tour with Viking?
Yes, it is. Yep.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Again, thanks for tuning in, and perhaps I'll see you again at some future cruise discussion.